you're here, I think.
Good afternoon. This is the 9th in our series of panels, public panels, on the basic subject we are addressing. Namely, we feel the globe is on a hinge of history. Things are changing rapidly. So we explore different places around the world and subject matters to try to understand better exactly what's happening. And we hope in the end we'll be able to make some suggestions about what to do about all these new things. Today we talk about the Middle East. And we have coming up on May 8th the way emerging technology will affect the US economy, and another one on stability in an age of disruption, in other words, governing over the problem of diversity, and we'll have others. So now I want to turn the panel over to Abbas Milani, who's a fellow here at the Hoover Institution and in charge of the director of his Iranian studies at Stanford, and a longtime friend. So Abbas, would you take over?
Thank you very much. Welcome to all of you. I would like to offer a special thanks to Secretary Schultz and Ms. Timby for having organized this. A special thanks to Mr. Schultz, who made it to our conference today after a great deal of effort. We were all looking forward, so very glad you made it, sir. Not just the world is at the hinge, at a historical moment. The Middle East, I think, is also the Middle East that has been with us for a long time. It was once a cradle of civilization. In the 19th century, it was a seat of a great deal of conflict between Russia and England. In the 20th century, it was the center of a Cold War contention. And since 1979, I think it's become one of the most important centers for trouble in the region and trouble around the world, as well as challenges that essentially are truly historic in dimension. We have a remarkable panel of people who are going to talk about this. The papers are available online. I strongly urge you to go to the papers and read what is now a 5-minute synopsis of lengthy, detailed papers. Our first speaker is Mullah Hicham. He is a member of the Moroccan royal family, but far more important than that, he is a remarkable erudite scholar of democracy, an advocate of democracy, a very successful entrepreneur, and someone who has studied the field and has remarkable experience, familial, personal, professional in the region, is going to talk about Saudi Arabia and what it holds in its future.
Well, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Once again, thank you to all the panelists. Thank you to the organizers. A special thanks to Secretary Schultz and his colleagues, Mr. Timby, who convened this meeting of importance. And thank you to all of us. As Abbas Milani pointed out, my paper is on the website. You can all consult it, and that's why I will not burden you with statistics and numbers, but I will just submit to you a few ideas. Well, all of us know who MBS is, Mohammed bin Salman, the heir apparent to the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia. All of us know that his project involves technology and it involves youth. This is the combination that is said holds a secret upon that will offer to Saudi Arabia stability and that will offer a prosperous future and growth. The ideas or the nexus between politics and technology and development are comprised or all encapsulated in his Vision 2030, which recognizes, like most astute observers, all of us being astute observers, if we read the New York Times every day, we're seeing that the world is transitioning away from hydrocarbons because of a variety of reasons, not least of which for a country of Saudi Arabia is due to the dwindling resources that hydrocarbons bring into the central bank and to the economy. As such, it has become an imperative to transition out of it, and hence the winning formula for Mohammed bin Salman is youth and technology. Well, there are two ways to look about this. One is an optimistic view, which says that with this combination, this is a winning combination, it'll basically bring about growth. The second view is to be a little bit more reserved and say, after all, there's no particular reason why this should work. It hasn't worked elsewhere. The youth bulge is a sociological reality, but there are other factors and other sectors and segments in the society that have an equal weight in the society, and it's not necessarily the panacea. My personal view to this is that it's neither this nor that, and I espouse the reserved scenario. Why? Because the central problem of Saudi Arabia to any, it's what we call the rentier state problematique, meaning that citizens are very easily incorporated into a pact by which the government buys their passivity, and there is this tacit or rather explicit deal. You have subsidies of the welfare state from cradle to grave, and in return you shall not intervene into politics. Breaking out of this rentier mentality or this rentier framework is very, very hard. And in fact, states are very, very cautious and very risk averse. So they want the advantages, but without paying the costs. I will give you a very few examples why this rentier state is overshadowing. In fact, it's even derailing the 2030 project, why it's making it, in a sense, irrealistic. Number one, you will notice that it is the state of Saudi Arabia that is building essentially the hallmark that exemplifies, the flagship that exemplifies this journey. It's called the Neom City of $500 billion, where robots and semiconductors are supposed to basically take over. And it's 33 times the surface area of New York. And this is presented to us as the solution that will leverage Saudi Arabia into an age of prosperity. How does that work? It's very vague. And that is precisely the point. The very fact that the state has to carry this project is precisely about control, is about we control what technology symbolizes, and we hence control what it means. You are going to consume, you are going to be consumers of technology and not end users, and not ones who will essentially dictate what's the content of that. And as a result, you will notice that while this is happening, at the same time you have human rights activists, bloggers, women activists who are themselves being arrested because they are using technology in a very different way. And I think the Netflix controversy in Saudi Arabia is precisely the point. Now features Telsa and features other, flagship industries, but here is Netflix that was banned from being aired in the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia because precisely it was explaining this problematic. So what the Saudi regime or what the Saudi system wants is essentially modernity or modernization without modernity. The tools of modernization without the substance, which is modernity and which is citizen empowerment and the possibility of self-emancipation. So in a nutshell, to end what the Saudi regime, what the Saudi system wants basically, or what is aiming at, is that it can replicate the Chinese model in which you have citizens that are wired and are hooked up, and that because of their electronic savviness and their consumerist trend are going to engage or provoke a virtuous and positive cycle that is going to pull us out of the age of hydrocarbons. So it's a very fragile proposition, and there'll be other things to talk about. But I think in a nutshell, this is what the paper describes. Thank you.
Well, we go from a country that uses modern digital technology as a showcase to a country that has used the digital technology and cyber technology as an engine of growth, Israel. And to help us understand Israel, we're very fortunate to have Dr. Arye Carmon, who spends a quarter out of the year here. The rest of the time he is in Israel. He is the founding president and director of the Israel Democratic Institute, who has fought literally all of his adult life to help save the democratic Jewish nature of the Israeli government and the Israeli polity, and trying to maintain what he thinks is the defining characteristic of the original mandate for Israel, which was a democratic society.
Thank you very much. Welcome to all of you. And I join the thanks to Secretary Schultz and Jim Timby for convening us. Talking about Israel in a nutshell, it's a huge challenge. You have to know that. And as you know, Israel is known basically from the ongoing conflict with its neighbors, which overshadows some of the more interesting and serious developments underneath our democracy. This is what I'd like to share with you, some highlights. There are some presuppositions that one who wants to understand Israel must have to take into account. Israel is the place where the Jewish people exercises its right for self-determination. And this is the first time that the Jewish people has exercised responsibility to political sovereignty after 2,000 years in exile, that they did not have anything like it. And of course, it overshadows everything that we face in our country. One of the major things that one has to take into account for reasons that are exceed this meeting is the fact that Israel does not have a constitution. In my paper, that again you can read where it is published on the net, I make a distinction between what I call the hardware, namely what happened in the past 70 years since the inception of the state in all the formal materialistic aspects of creating a state. And that is, we have democratic institutions, we have procedures, we have very strong army, we have very flourishing economy. And on the other side, we have a very ill operating software in our midst. So let me say a few things about each. As far as the hardware is concerned, the little country of ours has developed a fascinating industry in the high-tech. I have to underscore the fact that the high-tech industry occupies in Israel about 10% of the labor force, and it is comprised 35% of its export, which means that 90% of the labor force in Israel is not part of the high-tech. But as far as the high-tech is concerned, it's highly innovative and has placed Israel in the forefront in many aspects. In the cyber industry, in the AI, there are hundreds and hundreds of companies that are involved in each of these sectors. One other example of Israeli innovation is the revolution that has created in the water industry. 60% of Israel land is arid and semi-arid, and we have suffered from the whole issue of water, but a great innovation in Israel has created that we are not dependent on natural sources, and right now, in fact, Israel is independent in carrying the challenges of this industry. In a great contrast to the achievements in what I call the hardware, there are many major challenges in what I call the software. First and foremost, our political system, in many respects, has faced major problems in the past couple of decades. Well, you may not know, Israel is a parliamentarian democracy, and we have one of the smallest legislature in the world, and one of the few legislatures without two cameras. We have one chamber for our Knesset, our parliament, and this, of course, provides very narrow shoulders to carry enormous challenges. In the past 20 years, elections in Israel bring in a different type of political parties that make it very difficult to govern, and this is in the institutional side. At the same time, Israeli society is highly diversified among different groups, the Israeli Arabs, the ultra-Orthodox, the Orthodox, the newcomers, the veterans and whatnot. And there are enormous pressures that emanate from each of these groups and create a challenge to what we would endeavor down the line to create, and that is a collective, a common collective consciousness. I have to underscore one of the things which has been very divisive in our midst is what I call the territorialization of our identity. Israel has occupied territories for 52 years, as you are well aware of. And the dispute about these territories is among the most critical, divisive issues within Israeli society. And of course, it prohibits the creating of some sort of a common ground in our midst. So these are some of the huge challenges that we are facing, both politically, socially, and culturally. And let me stop here, and later if you have some questions, I'm sure you don't, we'll relate to it.
As many of you know, the political tumults in the Arab world, the recent political tumults began in Tunisia when someone decided to fight the existing oppression. And we have with us one of the most successful Tunisian entrepreneurs. He has created what the Forbes magazine has called one of the 10 most successful incubators in the world. He's an entrepreneur of many skills, everything from punk rock to TED Talk to enterprises. He has done it, and he's going to tell us about the experiences in Tunisia in the past and how he sees it going forward.
Thank you, Professor. It's a pleasure to be here, to be back to Stanford. Thank you all for coming. Secretary Schultz, Jim Timby, thank you for the invitation with Professor Milani. The paper that my team and I got together with participation of Matt Gardner, Kevin Coyne, Nasreen and Amani on my team, was talking about a comparison between three countries in the Arab world, which are Saudi, you influenced me, Prince.
United Arab Emirates?
Yeah. So the UAE, Egypt, and Tunisia on youth and entrepreneurship and innovation. And basically, just to summarize the three countries, I think two things. First, what's the difference between the three countries? UAE have vision and the money. Egypt have the market, and Tunisia have no choice. This is how. Then on the innovation, some people will argue like there is startup bubble, and a couple of friends, investors told me that when I asked them if it's a bubble, they said in the Arab world, to have bubble they need soap, and we don't even have the soap yet. So we are on the early phases of entrepreneurship. Now, coming back to Tunisia, Tunisia have been through a transition, to say the least. We transitioned from 50 plus years of dictatorship to a democracy, and this democracy is still in the making. So within this democracy, there is challenges. There is an economic crisis, high employment, mismatch between education and job markets. So between the degrees and you find a lot of people with degrees that are unemployed, and you have a lot of jobs that are not being fulfilled, and that's a big issue. Which is, for me, as an activist, it's a price worth paying for democracy, but that's my opinion. And then, following that, there is an emergence of new entrepreneurship. So basically, we see a kind of a movida. For the people who followed Spain, there is a cultural movida in Tunisia, but it's also an entrepreneurial movida, a startup movida. There is a movement of people who want to create things and change things. And the creative expression of the educated people, you can feel it everywhere in the society right now. You have people trying to do stuff all the time. Now, that trend haven't been followed by politicians, so basically a group of entrepreneurs and civil society institutions and investors come together and try to challenge that. So say, okay, how can we challenge the laws that are existing now that are not entrepreneur friendly? We came up after 2 years of work with the draft of a law called the Startup Act. And that Startup Act, we pushed the government, we brought the government to the table. It took us 3 years. They came, they embraced it, and it was voted last year and became one of the best laws for startup in the region and Africa, which is very inspiring. And we found that, okay, this is amazing. This is like a Trojan horse. So if we can do this about any other law and another subject, we can change things. And this is what my Think and Action Tank is trying to do, with getting people together and writing white paper that became law. Some of them became law. So now the country is an open path to long-term reconstruction in terms of economic structure. For decades, the largest portion of the economy was in the hand of few. We want to believe in an economy that can transfer toward more innovative business and projects in the hand of many, and in particular to the many young ones who were never invited to join the table and discussion in the past. Tunisia is facing a lot of challenges, one of which was brought to my attention again by Professor Diamond, which is corruption. But big structural corruption have been decreasing after the revolution, but while the direct small corruption is increasing, the other also challenge will be to work on informal economy and one solution to that is becoming a cashless society, and this is what gonna be our next fight for the next probably 3 or 4 years with the government, to convince them to become less a cash society. And this is it.
Thank you very much. I think most observers of the Middle East would agree that till a few years ago, the 3 pivotal countries in the Middle East were Egypt, Iran, and Turkey. And it's not by accident. These were countries that existed long before 19th century. These are countries that have a long tradition. And now, of course, Saudi Arabia and United Arab Emirates are trying to muscle their way into becoming as influential, as pivotal. So to help us understand Egypt, we are very fortunate to have Dr. Lisa Blaydes, who's a professor of political science here, is a senior fellow at the Freeman Spogli Institute, and the director of the Abbas program here at Stanford University. She has written extensively on Egypt and Iraq, as well as many other facets of the Middle East.
So today I'm going to be talking a little bit about forms of change and continuity in Egypt. So we know the last 10 years have seen forms of political disruption that were unthinkable in Egypt just 1 decade ago. From the 2011 protest uprisings to the 2012 election of Muslim Brotherhood candidate Mohamed Morsi, to the 2013 popular participatory veto coup, which kicked Mohamed Morsi out of office, to the 2014 let's say, selection into power of the current Egyptian president, Abdel Fattah al-Sisi. So these are huge changes. They're very disruptive changes. And we've really focused in Egypt on all of this change. But the other way to think about what's been happening in Egypt is that there's actually also been a lot of continuity. And in terms of continuity, what do I mean? Well, Egypt is still an authoritarian regime that is ruled by essentially an autocrat who is undergirded by an economically powerful military. So this has stayed the same. The other thing that stayed the same is that a lot of the structural, demographic, and economic conditions that were important in Egypt 10 years ago are still critically important today. So what do some of those issues look like? Well, we know that Egypt has a large youth population, and a youth population that tends to either be unemployed or underemployed. Now, economists have long argued that it's a combination of increasingly educated people with few job opportunities that create the structural conditions for protest uprisings. Those things in Egypt basically haven't changed, and we see similar conditions to these in Algeria or Sudan today. So Egypt's current population is 100 million people. And if the demographic projections are correct, by 2050, there'll be 150 million people in Egypt. And about 60% of the Egyptian population is under the age of 30. Now, even Egypt's main statistical agency will concede that the youth bulge and population demographics constitute a threat that's greater than the threat of terrorism in Egypt. And there are rumors in Egypt that President Sisi is very fearful of millennials. He has this large youth population. He doesn't really understand this population. He doesn't know how to deal very well with a youth population. Now, Egypt's their sort of unstable or difficult demographic conditions were not an inevitability. Egypt, until the 2011, had pretty good and declining population growth rates. So they were on a good trajectory to limit this explosive growth. But what happened is at that point, there became a lot of policy uncertainty. The year the Muslim Brotherhood came to power was actually one of the biggest spikes in birth rates in Egypt. And since 2011, we've seen birth rates increasing yet again, in some part because the regime has been very tough on international NGOs that used to provide most of the contraceptives in Egypt. Now, a very, very small percentage of contraceptives in Egypt are provided by international NGOs because a lot of the legislation around NGOs has been quite strict. So as the population of Egypt has grown, this has put a lot of strain on the country's infrastructure. You may have heard about a train accident in Egypt in the last few months. People say it reflected some of the bad infrastructural conditions in Egypt. There's a sense that the state lacks the political will and financial resources to really upgrade infrastructure in a meaningful way. I don't know if any of you guys have heard that the Egyptian government is actually planning to move the capital and all the bureaucracy buildings about 25 miles east along the Cairo to Suez Road in order to obviate the need to restructure some of the infrastructure in the capital and maybe also to insulate the regime from some of the protests that can happen in a big city like Cairo when you have the main government buildings near where a lot of people live. So now they're going to move the capital far away from where most people live and create a new upgraded infrastructure there. Now, over the last few years, Egypt has had respectable levels of economic growth. And when I say respectable, I mean hovering between about 3 and 5%. But these gains in economic growth have not been able to keep pace with the 700,000 new labor market entrants coming onto the Egyptian labor scene every year. And this is in a situation where only about half of Egyptian young adults are employed, despite the fact that many of these people do have college degrees. So there's a survey of young people in Egypt that's conducted by a group called the Population Council, and they've done a couple of waves of this survey, and it's pretty telling. They found that of Egyptians who are working, about 70% say that their jobs require no skills at all. And if you look at the percentage of college-educated people and people with no education who are asked that question, they answer in about the same way. So what does that mean? There are no returns to education for most of these Egyptians. They don't feel as though getting that higher level of education actually helps them. In Egypt, according to this survey of young people, only about 10% of respondents say they even need to use a computer for their work at all. And this is despite the fact that lots of young Egyptians not only use computers and the internet, but they're very technologically savvy and would like to have the opportunity to do that more in the future. Now, when young Egyptians are asked why they're unemployed, about 60% say that there's no work available for them at all. Another 20% say there's no suitable work for them, so they don't perceive the work that may be available as suitable given their field of study or given their educational background. And this has led Egyptians to be really pessimistic about their future. Only about 20% of Egyptians think the country's economic situation is good, and only about 30% believe that the country's future will be better for their children than it was for the parents. Now, because so many Egyptians, especially young Egyptians, believe that their future is not very good in Egypt, they've been undertaking dangerous trips across the Mediterranean to find employment and opportunities in Europe. And when respondents on this youth survey were asked why they wanted to leave the country, more than 90% stated that it was the lack of job opportunities that made them want to emigrate to Europe. Now, the real tragedy of this, of course, is that under the right circumstances, having a young and technologically savvy population could be really good for a country's economic growth. But Egypt does suffer from a crisis of investment and educational opportunity. So if you look at classrooms, classroom density in Egypt is typically over 100 kids in one class, and most of the 8th graders do not operate at a grade level literacy standard. So there are some real deficiencies in the quality of education that people might be receiving. Economists who have really tried to look in depth at this issue of opportunity crisis in Egypt have pointed to a kind of interesting fact, which is there has been a reduction in certain forms of inequality in Egypt, but basically what this has meant is the middle class has been looking more like the lower class, while the upper class has been pulling away from both. And so even if the aggregate inequality might be decreasing because lower class people are starting to rise, there's a crisis of the middle class in Egypt, which makes up about 40% of the population, where they're now starting to see their fates as looking more like what they perceive as the lower classes, and this is really creating a crisis of identity. So I'm just going to quickly mention a couple of other things. Beyond these challenges related to employment and education, Egypt struggles with two major population-level health crises. The first is that obesity rates in Egypt are the highest of anywhere in the world. And of course, this is associated with hypertension, diabetes, and this puts a big economic strain on the society. The other thing you may not know about Egypt is that right now they have the highest rates in the world of hepatitis C infection. So in the 70s and 80s, there was a big attempt to try to get rid of a disease that was born of a snail-borne parasite from the Nile River. Often entire villages were vaccinated or treated with a single needle. So this meant if anyone in the village had the hepatitis C infection, it would spread to many other people. That led Egypt to have about I think it's about 15% of the population is currently struggling with hepatitis C. Now, in the last few years, Egypt has partnered with a company called Gilead, which has got a new hepatitis C medication that they've offered at a much lower cost to Egypt. And they have had some success in registering people and stemming some of the spread of the disease. But imagine this, for every one person who has hepatitis C, they typically spread it to 3 other people. And there are about 150,000 people who are contracting hepatitis C in Egypt every year. So it's a pretty serious crisis. And currently, about 1/3 of Egypt's national health budget is spent on hepatitis C treatment. So this is a lot of money. Beyond these factors, I just want to mention one final thing, which is we know that Egypt is very vulnerable to climate change. So not only does the country rely almost entirely on Nile River water for its agricultural opportunities. We know that Egypt is on track to reach a threshold of absolute water scarcity by 2030. So this is a very serious situation for Egypt, with the shorter growing seasons associated with higher temperatures and the higher levels of evaporation that happen with climate warming. We also know the Nile Delta is eroding by about 10 meters a year, and this is reducing the overall level of agricultural land available. We know there are problems with salinity in the soils near the coastlines that make it difficult for farmers to do their job of growing Egypt's food. Egypt's also now going to become increasingly vulnerable to disruptions to the Nile. So the Ethiopians are currently constructing something called the Grand Renaissance Dam, which is going to be the largest dam in all of Africa once it's complete. And although there's no sign yet that the Ethiopians are engaged in any kind of like a holdup of the Egyptians with Nile water, of course, Egypt will be subject to whatever happens upstream by Ethiopia. And so this is something that Egyptians are very sensitive to because they are such a water scarce country. So I've painted a pretty grim picture, but I just wanted to give you guys a sense of what some of the challenges to stability are in Egypt in the next couple of years.
Well, Egypt was is a pivotal country for the Middle East. The next country we're going to talk about has been pivotal in the Middle East, but also pivotal to NATO and to the transatlantic alliance. I'm referring to Turkey, and we have Dr. Erdemir, who spent part of his adult life fighting for democracy in Turkey. And once he gave that up, or once he was forced to give it up, he spent the rest of his time studying the rise of authoritarianism in Turkey and fighting this rise by his prolific scholarly work. One of the unique aspects of what he did in Turkey, what he did his dissertation on, is his insistence on defending the rights of minorities in Egypt, religious minorities. Particularly, he wrote a dissertation on the Alaoui Shiites in Turkey, which constitute about a quarter of the population and are a very closely held secret. So he's going to talk about what he sees as the problems in Turkey and where Turkey is heading.
Thank you. Let me begin by taking a poll. If you believe that social media, including Facebook and Twitter, has played a role in US elections, please raise your hand. Good. Second poll. If you believe that migration, the issue of migration, has played a role in US elections, please raise your hand. That's what I'm going to talk about in Turkey, how transformations in demographics and technology, how social media and migration debates and generational change have played a role and continue to play a role in governance in Turkey. And to introduce Turkey to you, which is a paradoxical country, let me begin by NATO. Turkey is the second largest army in NATO after the United States. It has been a long-time ally since 1952. Even before Turkey was a NATO member, it was fighting alongside US. In the Korean War, the second largest fighting force was the Turkish army. But today, Turkey is about to become the first NATO member state to purchase air defense system from Russia, from NATO's main adversary. And today, Turkey is about to become the first NATO ally to be sanctioned by the United States. So quite a range of paradoxes. At the same time, the society itself is very much like the US, very polarized and divided. On the one hand, Turkey happens to have the staunchest supporters of secularism in the Muslim majority world. But at the same time, half the Turkish electorate have sustained an Islamist regime in power since 2002. And in most of the elections, we see a pretty neat 50-50 divide in Turkey between these warring factions, quite similar to the United States. Now, there are some disruptions to this political playing field. One is demographic and the other one is technological. When it comes to the demography, until recently, Turkey used to enjoy the youth bulge. Turkey had a demographic window of opportunity. Most of its working force, most of its population happened to be working force. So little strain on the, retirement system, on the pensions. But now Turkey is aging quickly. It's becoming an aging society. By 2035, it will become an aged society. The median age, which used to be below 20 back in the 60s, is now 32. And besides this, Turkey is transforming from being a sending country to a receiving country. Maybe some of you have heard the term Gastarbeiter. It's a German term which means guest workers. So Turks were the bulk of guest workers that Germany received in the aftermath of the Second World War. Today there are over 3 million Turks living in Germany. But that part of Turkish history is now becoming history itself, because Turkey is now also the world's largest top recipient of displaced Syrians. 3.6 million Syrians live in Turkey. And there are also others from Iran, Iraq, Afghanistan. So that is also a major change. A former sending society is now becoming a receiving society. A third major transformation is, just like US, now Turkey has diaspora voting. So Turkish citizens abroad can now vote for elections in Turkey. And when we take a look at diaspora voting patterns, we see an interesting mismatch between voters at home and voters who live abroad, but who can still call the shots back at home. So there are over 6 million Turkish citizens abroad, over 3 million, almost 4 million electorates. More than 50% go to the polls, the diaspora. And when we take a look at that, we see that there are two ways in which they differ from the population back at home. One, they tend to vote more strongly for the ruling Islamist party, because in the diaspora, they tend to be kind of more religious and more conservative. And at the same time, they tend to vote more for the pro-Kurdish party in Turkey, because Kurds happen to leave Turkey in greater numbers, given how Turkey fails to accommodate its Kurdish citizens, how it fails to recognize Kurdish rights and allow them political participation. Now, a fourth important demographic dynamic we see is the difference in fertility rates between Turkey's Kurdish citizens and Turkish citizens. In general, we see Turkish families, coming down to 2.1 kids on the average, which is just the bare minimum you need to sustain the population. But when we take a look at Kurdish fertility patterns in Turkey, they're much higher, which means increasingly the proportion of Kurdish citizens in Turkey will grow, which means Turkey's existing governance deficit will deepen, because we will continue to have a greater Kurdish underclass who don't feel that they have equal opportunities, who feel that their avenues to political participation are blocked, and who feel like an underclass. And this is pretty much the same picture for the displaced Syrians in Turkey. I'm not calling them refugees, because Turkey does not grant Syrians refugee status. They are under a special temporary protection regime. They can reside in Turkey, they can work in Turkey, but they have no clear path to permanent residency or citizenship. And already 400,000 Syrian children have been born in Turkey. But unlike US, where you have naturalization of the born children, they end up being stateless because the current Syrian regime will not recognize them as Syrian citizens, and Turkey will not grant them citizenship, which means increasingly Turkey will have a Syrian underclass who live in precarious conditions and who don't necessarily have any avenues to express their opinions and be part of the governance in Turkey. They're welcome as clients, as recipients of handouts, but they're not part of the Turkish polity as voters, as citizens. Now let's take a look at technology, how it affects Turkey. Just like in the US, technology can cut both ways, right? On the one hand, it has strengthened Turkey's ruling Islamist party's hand through strengthening surveillance techniques. Turkey is, I think, the only country in the world where Wikipedia is banned, Booking.com is banned, PayPal is banned. So very strict control of the social media. Even Twitter was banned for a while, and the Turkish president is on record saying that social media is a menace to society. But at the same time, he employs one of the largest troll armies in the world, harassing Turkey's dissidents and liberal Democrats. So just like social media, other technological apparatuses also cut both ways. So on the one hand, the government uses databases to control citizenry very closely, to decide who is a deserving citizen worthy of government handouts and who is not. But at the same time, dissidents use internet and technology to, first of all, find alternative channels of communication, alternative channels of news in a country where 90% of the print and visual media happen to be controlled by the government. But more importantly, for example, Turkey recently had local elections, and Turkey's battered opposition use, again, alternative technologies for ballot box monitoring. And Turkey's leading LGBTI advocacy organization, Kaos GL, uses the internet to reach out to populations, to groups that were beyond their reach before. Turkey's Jewish youth use a new digital platform, Hablaremos, which means let's speak in Ladino, to raise awareness about anti-Semitism in Turkey. And just like in the US, where you have a lot of fake news and disinformation campaigns, Turkey's fact-checking websites and digital platforms pool resources to basically push back against misinformation campaigns by doing online fact-checking. So technology both exacerbates Turkey's governance deficit, while at the same time help mitigate those very threats. So the moral of my story is the radical changes in demography and radical changes in technology can go either way. So there is no demographic or technological determinism at work. It doesn't necessarily lead to a dystopian or a utopian future. It's all up to our agency to do something with it, right? One of my favorite quotes is by the Italian theorist Antonio Gramsci, who said, "Pessimism of the intellect, optimism of the mind." So yes, it might be a very dark future for Turkey, just as it is the case for the Middle East. Or it can also be a very bright future for Turkey and the rest of the Middle East. The key, in my argument, to making this a positive change is to invest in Turkey's soft infrastructure. Turkey's Islamist government is known for its vanity projects, for its investments in hard infrastructure, in the new airport in Istanbul, in new tunnels, in bridges, in high-speed rail, in high-rises. And certainly they are very important, what we call the hard infrastructure. But at the same time, we also know that soft infrastructure matters, right? Greater governance capacity, rule of law, due process, media freedoms, human rights, education, healthcare. So if Turkey, as like other Middle Eastern countries, invests in soft infrastructure, enshrines fundamental rights and freedoms, and taps into the power of both the demographic window of opportunity as well as the technological innovations, we might have a NATO ally who is back on track with the transatlantic values. But if Turkey insists on investing all its resources on hard infrastructure to the detriment of soft infrastructure, to the detriment of rights and freedoms and democracy, then we might have a very dystopian future, not only for Turkey's citizens, but also for the transatlantic alliance, for NATO itself. As the second largest military in NATO, we might one day wake up and realize has defected to the authoritarian bloc of countries led by the number one adversary of the West these days, Russia. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We thought since you're going to hear so much about dystopias, we leave a discussion of Iran for the last to completely bring you back to joy. I'm going to briefly talk about the political landscape in Iran, and then Roya Pakzad is going to talk about the digital aspect of it. Let me say a couple of words about her. She has a master's in electrical engineering from USC and a master's in human rights from Columbia University. She is now working at FSI in a digital incubator, but also working with the Iranian Studies program on trying to study aspects of human rights and how it relates to the internet. Now, Iran has been experiencing some profound changes in the last century. Let me just give you a couple of examples. Iran in 1900 was a country that had 90% of its population in villages. Today, 25% at most live in the countryside. This is a process that in Europe took some 300 years. And the ones who are in the countryside are in villages that are connected almost invariably to the internet, are connected invariably to market, that are invariably internet savvy. Iran in 1900 had virtually 90% illiteracy. And the number of college graduates, there was no college at the time in Iran. There was a polytechnic. It was all male. There was no place for women to go to college. Today, the youth population, the population below 60, is virtually all literate. 60% of college graduates in Iran today are women. Women have made remarkable strides in spite of all the efforts by the regime to contain and curtail their social activity, because the model the regime has been advocating is the model of women as motherhood, women as staying home. Women have defied this and have organized in my view, one of the most remarkable movements of civil disobedience over the last 40 years, asking for an equitable share of the public domain, asking for sartorial freedom, asking for choice in marriage, and almost every other reality. The Iranian Revolution of 1979 brought together an incommensurate structure. An incommensurate structure in the sense that there is a clerical authority that claims to have divine legitimacy, literally claims that it does not need the support of the Iranian population, But the movement that overthrew the Shah was essentially a democratic movement. So there were many democratic aspects, many democratic demands. And to satisfy those demands, they created an electoral process. Iran has had very regular elections, as regular as any country in the Middle East, but they're rigged elections because increasingly, as the clergy consolidate their power, they began to curtail the people's choice. Now the clergy determine who can vote for every election. The clergy now have usurped the right to get rid of an elected official if that elected official behaves in ways they don't like. In other words, undermining the Republican principle, increasing the Islamic State component of this. And because of mismanagement, because of an almost 40 years policy of saying that piety is more important than professionalism, the Iranian economy is now facing, and also because the regime has spent hundreds of billions of dollars, either direct investment or lost economic opportunity, on a nuclear program that is very contested and I find to be ill-advised. The Iranian economy today, furthered by sanctions, is facing what I think is the most serious crisis. The financial system, the agricultural system, the water system, the retirement funds are all on the verge of collapse. They're on the verge of going bankrupt. And the regime's policy is torn between those who want to make compromises with the people, they're increasingly a minority, and those like Mr. Khamenei, who is the supreme leader, who wants to double down on the policies of the last 30 years. What gives me particular concern is that as tensions between the United States and Iran have increased, Iran seems to be doubling down on bringing to IRGC command, for example, in the last 24 hours, a very belligerent, a very ignorant, but a very belligerent new commander who thinks confronting the United States is the way to move forward. But underneath this regime, this intolerant, intransigent, clerical, authoritarian regime, corrupt, cronyist regime, you have a vital Iranian civil society, I think one of the most vital in the Middle East. Women are the leaders of this movement. Iranian society is extremely internet savvy, and Roya is going to describe to us all in 4 or 5 minutes. We tried to describe Iran as a rosy picture in 5 minutes. So I did it in 2, 3. Now she's going to do it in 3, 4.
Sure. Thank you so much, everyone, for joining us today. And thank you to organizers and Dr. Milani for inviting me. As Dr. Milani mentioned, I'm going to start with some positive points about internet status in Iran. So Iran, in terms of internet access, 60% of the population, they have access to the internet. 47 million of people, they're active users of mobile internet and social media. The most used social medias are Telegram messaging apps and Instagram, Twitter, LinkedIn, and all the other social media applications. In terms of entrepreneurial activities, Iran actually has a very vibrant entrepreneurial activities, but in terms of innovation, their work is mostly focused on creating applications or something that we call it copycat applications. And the reason is Iranian people inside Iran, they cannot have access to international applications and software, so the entrepreneurial activity is more focused on creating those homegrown replication of those applications that we use commonly in the United States. But it's important to also to mention that Iranian governments, they have been very active in providing internet with fast speed to Iranian people, so they could increase their rank in the world in terms of access and development. But when it comes to internet freedom, unfortunately, based on Freedom House recent report, Iran is the second to least worst country in terms of internet freedom and in terms of surveillance, in terms of censorship for its citizens. But how did that happen? starting in 2006, Iranian governments, they started thinking that they're losing their monopoly on the information and internet. So they proposed a policy called National Information Network. And through that National Information Network, they proposed a policy of isolation or localizing internet. Everything from infrastructure, from data centers, from servers, all the way to content. They wanted to create Islamic contents. They wanted to create content that it's more in line with the value of the regime, and also the services that are homegrown and domestic. But what is important to note that, and as a human rights person, that is very important to me, is like how people inside Iran, they reacted to all this censorship. Because so many websites, just like Turkey, they are blocked. Twitter is blocked, although Iranian governments themselves, they use Twitter and Instagram. And, but Iranian people inside Iran, they always showed resistance. There are surveys that it says that more than 70% of people, they use VPN. They do not trust homegrown messaging applications, but they trust the other applications that are Instagram or Telegram. And they have always challenged this government's censorship. But something that I also want to note that it's because of the help of diaspora community outside the country, especially in the United States and Europe, diaspora community became a major advocate for internet freedom in Iran. And through their advocacy, starting from 2011, through the Nonpartisan Act, United States passed general licenses in order to ease some sanctions for letting technology companies to provide some of their services to Iranian people in terms of information and communication technologies. But moving forward, Iranian governments, they become smarter. They don't use only just simple blocking websites. These days, they have different bodies of volunteer peer surveillance methods. They are flooding social media with pro-regime content. So the policy has changed and it resembles more to like China's model. That it's not just about blocking, but they themselves, they want to flood the content, flood pro-regime content. But what is important to note that how far governments can go in terms of like their censorship and tightening the net, and how Iranian people, they can resist that. But what is important to note, I think we have some representative from technology companies, is that Iranian diaspora community and technology companies in the United States, they're responsible partly because some of them, they block their services. Apple and Google, they block some of their services to Iranian people. That those kind of blocking, it plays into government's narrative of cyber sovereign states, of isolating internet. Because Iranian governments, they're going to say that we are not the one that blocking services. These companies are the one that are actually blocking the services. So it's actually helped the government. It helped the government narrative of sovereignty. So I would like to conclude now, but I'm looking forward to your questions.
We have two mics on two aisles. Please wait to be called and have a mic to ask a question. Please refrain from making long statements. And we'll try to be brief in our responses. In the past.
Hello. So my name is Awati Bilimam. I'm originally from Morocco. So thank you for your insights about governance in Middle East. So we heard lots in the news about the situation in Middle East, and it's always a little bit dark, you know. So I would like to ask if you can give some insights about people, like civil society people who really were working to change the situation in this region for decades. But we never gave the chance so that the media, speak about them. And I think, they are really doing, maybe, their work, it's not, how can I say, you feel it, because of the situation there, you can't get really to see, the results quickly. But I think, in Morocco, because of the because of these people, we could have some law changes, family law, and so maybe, if you can say a little bit about this. Thank you.
The vibrant civil society in the Middle East.
The vibrancy of civil society in the Middle East. Well, yes, I was back in this campus in 2008, and we were in 2008, all the discussion was about how immutable authoritarian regimes were in the area, how there was an exception, and that exception was about authoritarianism in the Middle East. And it was a reality and we wouldn't change it. And then all of a sudden, the Arab Spring came along. And now the Arab Spring, we can agree, has imploded. But the Arab Spring is a process. It's not an event. And if anything, for answering your question, we have to understand why it has imploded, with the exception of Tunisia. Two reasons, I think, that are very succinct to this area. First of all, the youth that brought, the classes that brought, or the groups that brought change about in this area are comprised of youth and young people who carried the banner of universal ideals and values. Contrary to other regions in the world, they have limited their role to that of observer. They exerted pressure so that the regime fell, and then they essentially limited their role to being observers without transforming themselves into political parties, etc. Because they saw their role as civil society purely and not as political society. So here's one partial answer to your question. It's important that that civil society makes an incursion into politics. Of course, if it does that, then it doesn't become civil society, but it's important for the youth to understand that they have to play a role in politics. Otherwise, the old professional politicians organize themselves and hijack the political process, and this is exactly what happened with Islamists. I won't generalize, but Islamists basically hijacked the process along with remnants of the old regime. But we've seen that politics is also about a learning curve. And we've seen that in the Sudan, as the Arab Spring continues, wider sectors of the society are intervening, and they're making sure that they're staying in the process and not disengaging. Algeria is the same thing. It's not enough for Bouteflika to leave. Now we want to know what's the second step. So there's a learning curve on that. The second problem, and regretfully there's not a solution for that, is contrary to all the other transition processes in the other regions. Outside forces welcomed change and ushered in change by helping to play facilitating roles. In the Arab Spring, what happened was a very strong geopolitical component. Essentially, outside forces, regional forces, did everything to derail that process. They encouraged a coup d'etat in Egypt by injecting billions of dollars, basically giving Sisi all the means to install a highly autocratic regime, and the adventure is continuing in Yemen and Libya and so forth. And that is unprecedented in the region. What we can do to rein in those forces, I'm afraid there's not much to do. It's about the architecture of world politics, and here we come at a time when there's populism in the West, where the Trump administration is everything but playing a positive role in the region, but that will run its course sooner or later. So I think what's important, the takeaway lesson here is to remain engaged, to remain vigilant, and to be implicated on a day-to-day basis. And that lesson has been rolled. And again, it's not a process, it's an event.
Good afternoon. My name is Edward Strickland. I was a graduate student here, and I'm an MIT Sloan Fellow. In regards to the young people in the Middle East outside of Israel, their access to open education is limited and hindered based on censorship of cherry-picking what they need to know and mimic what happens from highly innovative nations. What is the strategy for the young people to gain the knowledge, to be technological consumers, so that they can leapfrog with that technology? Because if you want to be a technology consumer or developer, it's not a staggering stage, it's more of an advanced stage of leaping forward beyond the imagination with creativity, to integrate that creativity with the tools. I can't see it happening because it's like you're having your cake and you want to eat it at the same time.
Let me add a comment about Iran. Iran is an example of a place where actually university education has been widely made available to a large part of the population. At the beginning of the revolution, Iran had 90 entering class university seats. Iran now has almost 4 million. Iran has increased the number, but the quality is not there. The quality, unfortunately, is very, very mediocre. There are maybe 3 or 4 universities that can compete in any meaningful sense with the international community. I think part of the problem is what has been referred to. These countries are given to show cases. These countries are given to quantifying numbers. Iran is one of the biggest contributors to scientific journals in the world. But when you actually do the work, as a group of scholars at Iranian Studies have done, you see that it's profoundly compromised.
I understand that because Iran
Just one second, he wants to say something. Go ahead.
Going back to your
I
question
apologize.
about education, is for me the answer is very simple. It's YouTube, man. Dude, I shouldn't say it here in Stanford because I highly respect this institution, but education all over the world is changing. And when you see what School 42, go to San Jose, go to School 42 or go to Paris, etc., and see the peer-to-peer learning that is happening on the coding skills, and see what is happening with edX, see what's happening with YouTube. Now, I'm really, really questioning diplomas. I think in the last 20 hires I had in my company, I haven't looked at any diploma, or I haven't asked about any diplomas. In my country, we learned in the dark times of dictatorship. We had access to culture through piracy, and now we have access to education through YouTube. And wherever autocratic regime there is right now, wherever they do, at the end of the day, there is always proxies, and people will learn wherever they want. And we saw that even when you look about firearms now. People are sharing, and back in the days in the dark web, now more like in torrents of websites, blueprints on how to print your own gun at home using a thing. So even if you as a regime, you cherry pick whatever you want to do at schools, education is not happening in schools. Education is happening in your cell phone, on your computer, and on the street. So
the foundation needs to be established.
Maybe get another question, one last question.
One moment. So in an innovative nation, the grandfather understood calculus, the father understood calculus, and then the granddaughter understood calculus, and then that leaped the nation into innovation and leading. But how does that foundation get established when it's repressed in the education? That's from the basics.
But there are going to be two parts to leapfrogging a country like Tunisia from a lower level of economic development to a higher one. One is related to human capital development, basically education, teaching people the skills they need, the calculus they need, the background they need. But the other part is institutional. So you have to set up the right types of institutions, in other words, the rules of the game, the type of protection from predation, the type of property rights, so that people believe that their investment in human capital can actually lead to some gains from that investment. And right now in a lot of Middle Eastern countries, you have people trying to invest in human capital. It may not be the best investment because the quality might be relatively low, but if they don't feel as though they're going to get any protection from their investment, then they're going to always feel like that human capital investment is not really worthwhile. So that'll decrease their incentive to invest in themselves. So you have to have both simultaneously, the right institutional configuration, but also the right types of human capital opportunities. And one without the other is not going to be enough.
My name is Mujalli Murshidi. I'm from Jordan. I'm a visiting scholar at Stanford. Quite a few of the gloomy picture which the lecturers here gave us is really related to conflicts between the countries which constitutes the Middle East and North Africa. And that, on top of these internal problems in that area comes the Israeli-Palestinian problem. I wonder how much our colleague here from Israel, or who talked about the Israeli situation, I don't know how much active Israel really in trying to put a solution for that serious conflict, because I think I come from Jordan, we have a lot of economic problem, etc. I think if that core issue is solved, probably you will have a very smiling Middle East rather than a very gloomy Middle East. Thank you.
Well, I don't have an answer. You touch upon one of the most divisive issues in my own country, and it lasts now for 52 years. Basically, there are two different views, as you know, and I don't need to repeat it. I can say to you, if I look something to the positive side, in the last 10, 15 years, in an ongoing survey that we call the Israel Democracy Institute the Peace Survey, we've noticed that constantly and consistently between 60 and 70% of the Israelis would welcome any effort toward peace. However, the overwhelming majority of Israelis don't believe that it is possible. One of the major things that happened, in my view, is the sense that there is no partner on the other side. I'm sure that on the other side they feel the same as far as we are concerned. So I think that we have been facing a stalemate in that process. There have been attempts until about a decade ago. In the last decade, unfortunately, we've not seen initiatives taken seriously. More than that, I really don't know what to tell you. There is growing sense that perhaps there is no solution for the two-state solutions, and that we might be headed toward a different solution, which in my view, it's going to be a disaster. Israel defined itself as a Jewish and democratic, and Israel cannot, in my view, give up either of the two major clusters of values. If the current status quo continues, we definitely will have to give up one of the two. And from the Israeli selfish perspective, it is going to be an existential disaster.
But there's also something else happening. We have to look within ourselves when we say smiley Middle East. Part of the reason why also there is no traction is the Arab camp has completely withered away. Why? Because when the Arab Spring broke out, people actually were concerned on local agendas, national agendas. And they were fighting regimes, and they wanted to deprive regimes of populist slogans. The Palestinian issue was a populist slogan which many regimes used as precisely a way to dampen and to control. The famous slogan is "La صوت تعلى فوق صوت المعركة." No noise should be above that of the grand battle. The battle being the liberation of Palestine was a way to suppress legitimate demands for rights and so forth. So at the end of the day, many of these Arab populations started ignoring the Palestinian problem. That does not mean that they do not feel solidarity with their brethren. It does mean that strategically, this issue has taken the second burner. Second development, which is very important, comes the counter-revolution. The counter-revolution organized by some countries in the Gulf with Egypt. They are pushing back against the winds of change. And they are under the firm conviction that bilateral relations, everything but non-declared, and especially on the security level, with the right government from the right, with the Likud, will give them basically a mandate from Washington to suppress their populations and do whatever they want. So the Palestinians are caught between what's happening, what my colleague is saying, what's happening inside the body politique of Israel, but also what's happening regionally by governments that are running towards Israel to normalize, but without formal recognition, because they are scared of their populations, but they want a mandate from Washington, and this disconnect from people who do not want anything to do with populist agendas and who want to concentrate on local agendas.
And one of the reasons they're running towards Israel is fear of Iran. Saudi Arabia, United Arab Emirates, they're trying to align with Israel because they see a great threat from Iran. Do we have? Yes.
Hello, my name is Lubna, and I'm from Syria. My question is for every member of the panel. If you're given the power to make one reform decision in one country in the Middle East and North Africa region, what would that decision be, and what that country would be? Thank you.
Syria.
No.
Who wants to take that?
Do we have an hour now?
Is this recorded somewhere? Listen, for Tunisia, it's really simple question. I think less involvement of our government should choose a path, either socialism or capitalism, but it needs to choose a path. Right now, we're living in a country that is defined by a friend of mine as liberal North Korea, and definitely our government need to stop being a player and become a referee and embrace the wind of change. This is on Tunisia thing, and on the Arab League thing, or in the Middle East or North Africa, and someday we have to redefine Middle East and North Africa. But one thing that needs to disappear, one way or another, is the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. That needs to disappear. But either by any means, we've been listening. People my age, I'm 35. People my age don't care anymore. We need to grow and we need to move forward. And this needs to really end. And hopefully we won't see a war between the Arab and Iran, because that's going to be disastrous for everybody.
And if I had a magic wand, I would use it for the entire Middle East, and I would replace the ethos of blaming outside forces with the ethos of taking responsibility for our own mistakes and shortcomings.
Yes, I think that's very important up until now. I think that's a very important point. Up until now, we've been living with this obsession of a plot, and a Western plot that if sharks appear in Sharm el-Sheikh, you know, it's the Israelis that let them out, and so forth, because they are fatalist and they're defeatist. However, there is an important, very important distinction. The West has to come up to the plate and has to be responsible. It has to be responsible. We're not asking, you know, for any Marshall Plan. We're not asking for any preferential treatment. We're just asking that the universal values you apply to yourselves, that the governments apply to others. When a journalist like Jamal Khashoggi is put and cut in 1,000 pieces and put in a basket, governments ought to be able to say no. It's very simple. We're not asking for the, you know, we're not asking for the, this addiction on oil and this addiction on contracts is creating a very destructive, myopic situations. Then we get Al-Qaeda, then we get all sorts of crazy dictators, we get, we dig a bigger hole and we're all sinking together. And to think that that the buck can just be passed on or kicking the can down the street, at the end of the day, the bill is going to be very high. And the more we realize this, you know, I'm not saying that realpolitik will be thrown out of the window, no. But realpolitik has to be constrained with a little values, just a little human decency. And that will be a big change.
Please join me in thanking the panel for an extraordinary discussion.
Thank you for your addition to this question.
Oh, thank you.
Appreciate it.
That was a great remark.
To the, yes.
That's
Yeah.
great.